Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking on a text that, it really transcends the military shelf and defines strategy across cultures and millennia. Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
It is arguably the most cited yet least understood strategic treatise ever written. Most people only know the surface-level maxims, the sound bites you see simplified and put onto motivational posters.
Exactly. We're moving far beyond know yourself, know your enemy. Our mission today, for you, the learner, is to get a really thorough, customized understanding of this profound work. We're going to plunge into the text, sometimes shocking, sometimes controversial origins, and synthesize centuries of critical thought.
Yeah, and explore the precise foundational strategic framework that China's greatest generals and scholars actually studied.
And to do that, we can't just read the 13 chapters.
Right.
Because they're famously terse.
Oh, incredibly so. We have to look at the rich source material surrounding the text. I'm talking about the critical historical commentary, the context provided by translators like Lionel Giles, and the essential insights of over 10 distinguished Chinese annotators.
We're talking figures from Tao Te in the 2nd century, all the way to Tu Mu centuries later.
Exactly. These commentaries, they span 2 millennia, and they are the true shortcut to understanding the text's profound political and, psychological insights.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. I think we have to start with the biggest academic puzzle surrounding the book, which is really an identity crisis. Did the man we know as Sun Tzu actually write the book? Did he even exist in the way history remembers him?
That is the million-dollar question. The founding narrative, the traditional story, comes from the records of the Grand Historian, which was compiled by Sima Qian in the 1st century BC. And this record, it asserts that Sun Tzu was a native of the state of Qi.
And crucially, he was employed by King Ho-Lu of Wu around 512 BC, right in the middle of that volatile spring and autumn period. This account says that Sun Tzu composed the 13 chapters specifically for the king.
And not just that. It credits him with stunning military success, crushing the powerful state of Chu, capturing its capital, Ying. He was presented as a celebrated general. It paints this picture of a historical military superstar.
That is the official, clean, almost heroic narrative. But then you run into the problem.
You run into the problem, the huge problem that launches centuries of historical skepticism. And that is the powerful silence of the greatest contemporary record available to us, the Sun Tzu.
And we need to explain why this silence is so damning. The Sun Tzu wasn't just some fragmented archive. It was the meticulous, premier historical record of that era.
Absolutely. It documented everything. Political maneuvering, diplomatic exchanges, detailed accounts of military figures and skirmishes. It mentioned generals and political figures, some of whom were, frankly, quite minor figures, as some later commentators noted, vulgar plebeians.
So if a general of Sun Tzu's reported brilliant fame and achievements was the guy who crushed a major power like Chu, his absence from the Sun Tzu is, to use the scholar Ye Shuxin's term, it's glaring.
It's more than glaring. It's like reading a comprehensive history of the Napoleonic Wars and finding no mention of Wellington or Napoleon himself. It doesn't make sense.
That context makes the doubt pretty much inescapable. So Ye Shuxin, he sees this colossal gap, and he suggests that the work was likely the production of a private scholar living a bit later.
Right, toward the end of the spring and autumn period, or the beginning of the Warring States period, so around 480 BC, he basically theorized that all the exciting stories about Sun Tzu's military genius were just big talk on the part of his followers who were trying to legitimize a new text.
So this suspicion gives rise to the idea that the text is pseudonymous, or at the very least that the biography is wildly flawed.
It does. However, the text's antiquity and authenticity, placing it squarely in that early period, are very strongly supported by independent evidence. So we can date the text itself early, even if the author's biography is suspect.
Okay, so what evidence do we have to lock down that early date for the strategic content itself? Forget the author for a second.
Well, we have several solid threads. First, direct reference. The earliest known direct reference to Sun Tzu actually predates Sima Qian's official history. You find it in the Huainan Tizing, whose author died in 122 BC.
So that confirms the work existed and was known before the traditional biography was formally established. That's a huge anchor point.
It is. It shows the work was known and respected decades before the official historical narrative was compiled. Second piece of evidence. Outright plagiarism.
Which was the highest form of flattery back then, right?
In a way, yes. Later foundational military writers, most famously Wu Qi, who died in 381 BC, so only about a century after the alleged date of Sun Tzu, they frequently incorporated substantial passages, sometimes word for word, from the 13 chapters.
Which means the work had to be established, accepted, and widely available for that level of unacknowledged appropriation to happen. It confirms the text was foundational before 400 BC.
Exactly. And then the internal evidence is perhaps the most compelling for dating the text accurately, what the text itself describes about warfare.
What does it describe that places it so firmly in the 5th century BC?
Well, you find references to ancient land tenure systems and, crucially, descriptions of warfare that rely heavily on armored chariots. The military landscape described in Sun Tzu is pre-imperial. It involves these decentralized feudal princes, the Du, and relies on systems of mobilization and transport that had, they largely died out by the later Chao dynasty.
So it's a technological and social timestamp embedded right in the text.
It is. This context strongly suggests the document dates to the 5th century BC, if not earlier. It's truly a product of that early warring states era.
Okay, and this is where we find that aha moment, the chronological puzzle that kind of reconciles the text's antiquity with the biography's flaws. And it centers on the relationship between two states, Wu and Yue.
Right. So the traditional biography places Sun Wu's employment with King Holu starting around 512 BC. At that point, Wu's primary concern was their hereditary enemy, Chu.
But two crucial passages in the text, one in chapter 6, weak points and strong, and another in chapter 11, the 9 situations, they discuss the intense ongoing conflict between Wu and Yu.
And that's the key. The famous quote from chapter 11 is indelible. It illustrates the necessity of cooperation despite enmity. The men of Wu and the men of Yu are enemies, yet if they are crossing a river in the same boat and are caught by a storm, they will come to each other's assistance just as the left hand helps the right.
That feels like a very specific contemporary reference.
It is. This internal evidence forces a recalibration of the timeline. If the text was genuinely written for King Holu, it must have been composed later in his reign when Yu became the serious military threat. That was likely between 505 and 496 BC.
So right after the major campaign against Chu and before King Holu's death, that gives us a perfect historical window.
It does. It provides the perfect window for Sun Wu to consolidate his strategic findings. The implication is that the traditional biography might have simplified the timing or, exaggerated the achievements, but the text itself is genuine.
And it dates precisely to that critical moment of strategic thinking in their early 5th century BC. It confirms the author was writing as a man of Wu, facing the very real threat of Yu.
Which brings us to the evolution of the text itself. Because having sort of settled its antiquity, we have to look at how it changed. The 13 chapters we read today are not the whole story, at least according to early references.
Right, the textual history is its own mystery. The Honshu bibliography lists the works of Sun Tzu of Wu in, get this, 82 chapters with 9 scrolls of diagrams. That is a colossal difference from the 13 we possess.
82 versus 13. It's a massive discrepancy. However, scholars generally agree that the original 13 chapters form the core essence of Sun Tzu's strategic insight.
So what were the other 69?
They were almost certainly later apocryphal works, or maybe detailed question and answer dialogues or extended exegeses that grew around the core text. But that core was always recognized as the essential strategic heart.
So the 13 chapters are the pure, unadulterated source material, and the rest were kind of like footnotes and expansions that got attached over time. The survival and fidelity of that core text it's an incredible story of scholarly detective work.
It really is. By the Ming Dynasty, copies were somewhat corrupted. The reliable standard text we use today was painstakingly reconstructed in the late 18th century by a scholar named Sun Xingyan.
How do you do it?
He compared a newly discovered edition with fragmented but older versions preserved in vast imperial encyclopedias. I mean, these massive ancient libraries that contain snippets of text that otherwise would have been lost forever. This process ensured the text's accuracy against centuries of transcription error.
That restoration effort really highlights the absolute centrality of the critical commentaries. We have to talk about the man who first cemented the 13 chapters as canon.
Tiao?
Yes, the founder of the Kingdom of Wei, who annotated the text around 200 AD. Tiao wrote the earliest extant commentary, and his motive was entirely practical.
He wasn't an academic.
Not at all. He found that military commanders treated the work as mysterious, almost magical, and they were often unwilling to publicly explain its teachings. As a powerful commander himself, he wanted to demystify it and outline a rough explanation of the whole for his officers.
And the sources describe his notes as reflecting his personality. They were models of austere brevity, often so compressed that they needed further commentary themselves to be intelligible.
Exactly. He was a stern, decisive general, and his writing reflected that succinct, no-nonsense approach. But his efforts led directly to the great historical controversy of the textual tradition, the claim made by the 9th century commentator, Tu Mu.
The famous pruning theory. Tu Mu claimed that Tia Tao, in his effort to outline the whole, had actually pruned away several 100,000 words of redundancy to create the single 13-chapter essence we know.
Which is a radical claim. It suggests that the foundational text was drastically edited by the very man who first canonized it.
Okay, but wait. If Tu Mu, centuries later, said that Tiao cut hundreds of thousands of words, what makes modern scholars ascertain he didn't? What was the motive behind that claim?
Well, modern scholarship largely rejects Tu Mu's claim because the 13 chapters were already recognized and circulated as the authoritative text centuries before Tao. We know this from Suma Qian's record.
So Tu Mu's theory was just wrong.
It's likely a misinterpretation, a grand myth that grew around Tiao's true contribution, which was simply writing a brief explanation, or Lu Qi not undertaking a massive redaction. Tiao solidified the 13 chapters as the standard. He didn't drastically edit them down.
That distinction is key. Canonizing versus editing. Okay, so let's look at the wealth of insight provided by the later annotators beyond Tiao's terse initial efforts. They provided the essential historical and philosophical context.
And the volume of commentary is staggering. It's a testament to the inexhaustible nature of war and its artifices. Tu Mu, despite his pruning theory error, is essential. He was a famous poet, and he provided copious historical parallels showing how Sun Tzu's rules played out in real campaigns.
And his definition of Sun Tzu's core paradox is perhaps the most critical synthesis we have.
Absolutely. Tu Mu asserted that Sun Tzu's philosophy boiled down to the absolute strategic necessity of balance. Practice benevolence and justice, but on the other hand, make full use of artifice and measures of expediency.
It's the constant tension between morality and ruthlessness.
That's the heart of it. And then you have Chan Yu, who is the figure who really made the original wisdom accessible.
How so?
Chan Yu is highly praised because he took Tian Shao's short, dense, sometimes obscure notes, and he expanded them in a masterly fashion, using clear prose and examples. He made sure the obscure wisdom was intelligible to wider generations of military students for centuries.
This text was so highly regarded that it transcended mere military study.
It absolutely did. The ultimate appreciation came from influential literary men like Su Sun, who is the father of the great poet Su Tongpei. They considered the 13 chapters superior to the Analects and the Book of Changes.
Specifically, yes, they listed those.
That is shocking. Superior to the foundational ethical and philosophical texts of China. What does that tell us about what they valued in the text?
It tells us they saw Sun Tzu not just as a manual for fighting, but as an essential guide to political, psychological, and, frankly, survival strategy in a world where conflict was the constant state of affairs. It provided a stark, pragmatic framework for reality that often superseded the high moral ideals of Confucian philosophy when survival was on the line.
So with that context, let's dive into the strategic content itself. Chapter 1, Laying Plans. Sun Tzu insists that victory is determined long before the first arrow flies. How?
Through the comparison of what he calls the 5 constant factors. These are the fundamental pillars a commander must evaluate both in his own forces and those of the enemy. It's basically a strategic checklist. But the takeaway after we list them is that Sun Tzu demands we treat the political climate and the meteorological forecast as equally critical inputs as, say, logistics.
That's it, exactly. The 5 factors are, first, the moral law, or Tao, which isn't morality, it's political cohesion. The degree to which the people are in complete accord with their ruler.
Their morale and willingness to follow him into danger.
Precisely. Second is heaven. Climate, timing, the seasons, night and day, cold and heat. Third is earth. The physical and geographical factors, distances, terrain, narrow passes, and the chances of life and death determined by your position.
Okay, so moral law, heaven, earth. What are the last 2?
Fourth is the commander. The quality of leadership, defined by wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. And fifth is method and discipline. The hard logistics, so organization, marshaling, supply lines, and military expenditure.
So the first strategic pillar isn't victory, it's holistic survival and stability. He's demanding a commander perform a total pre-mortem on the military, political, and even meteorological state of affairs.
Absolutely. And these five factors, they lead directly into the seven considerations, which is the comparative calculus. Deliberations are made by comparing our position with the enemy's on all these points, asking, whose troops are better disciplined? Which side has a commander with more capacity? This deliberation forms the initial strategic estimate, which is the cornerstone of the entire campaign.
This pre-assessment is everything because it determines the second foundational pillar, which is the really radical rule. All warfare is based on deception. Deception isn't a tactic, it's the foundation.
Precisely. Sun Tzu mandates that every action, every deployment must be viewed through the lens of calculated misdirection. And the specific rules for feigning are very precise. When you're able to attack, you must seem unable. When you are near, make the enemy believe you are far away.
Pretend weakness to encourage their arrogance. Feign disorder to lure the enemy in and crush them.
The goal is to confuse the enemy's perception of your strength, which sets the stage perfectly for the definition of victory itself in Chapter 3, attack by stratagem. The supreme goal is not a glorious battle. It's achieving victory intact, subduing the enemy without fighting.
And the famous hierarchy of generalship makes this concept brutally clear.
It does. The best policy is attacking the enemy's plans in their inception, stopping them before they even start. Second best is preventing the junction of his forces. Third is attacking his army in the field.
And the worst policy of all, besieging walled cities. The siege is the meat grinder.
It is a political and military disaster. And Sun Tzu calculates the monumental cost in detail. Preparing the implements, the mantlets, movable shelters, and the massive earth mounds, he says it requires 3 months. The actual piling up takes 3 months more.
6 months before the first frontal assault. That time frame alone makes siege warfare a political, not just military disaster. It drains the national treasury and the morale of the people.
And the inevitable result. The general loses his patience after the delay and launches his men to the assault. Sun Tzu starkly warns that 1/3 of his men are slain, yet the city still remains untaken.
A total failure.
The result of skillful leadership, by contrast, is securing triumph with forces intact, capturing cities and overthrowing kingdoms without lengthy, bloody operations.
This principle of strategic avoidance extends even to the political relationship between the general and the sovereign. Sun Tzu grants the general absolute authority over the fighting decision.
He does. The general is the bulwark of the state. Therefore, the crucial rule is, if fighting is sure to result in victory, you must fight, even though the ruler forbid it.
And the reverse is also true.
The reverse is true. If fighting will not result in victory, you must not fight, even at the ruler's bidding.
Wait, doesn't that effectively make the general the supreme ruler during war? What are the political dangers of granting a commander that level of impunity, telling him to disobey the highest command?
It places an immense, almost impossible burden of judgment solely on the commander. It acknowledges the fatal disconnect between the political reality in the capital and the military reality on the field. The ruler deals with diplomacy and appearances. The general deals with life and death.
So if the general is competent, if he has those 5 virtues, then his military necessity overrides political decree.
That's the theory. But if he is wrong, he risks execution or even civil war. It's a high-risk, high-reward system based entirely on the general's perceived capacity.
And that burden of judgment certainly extends to the financial and logistical realities of war, which Sun Tzu explores with almost clinical precision in Chapter 2, Waging War. Let's talk about that calculus of cost.
This section is practically accounting. Prolonged campaigns are financially ruinous. Sun Tzu quantifies the economic strain. He estimates that 3/10 of a household's income will be dissipated in meeting military needs.
And what about the state?
The state government expenses for maintaining chariots, armor, supplies, and heavy wagons will amount to 4/10 of its total revenue.
7/10 of the national economy devoted to military expenditure. Does this ancient accounting still hold true for modern defense budgeting?
I mean, it speaks to the political unsustainability of prolonged high-intensity conflict. Sun Tzu's analysis forces the sovereign to recognize that the first strategic pillar isn't just victory, it's economic survival. If you waste the national substance, you lose the moral law. The people turn against you.
And that context makes his argument for speed utterly compelling.
That's why the core principle is rapidity versus delay. Though we have heard of stupid haste in war, cleverness has never been seen associated with long delays.
There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare.
The corollary is brutal. Only he who truly understands the evils of prolonged war, the drain on the national substance, can understand the profitable way of carrying it on. And that is through overwhelming rapidity.
And rapidity demands light logistics, which allows for maximum tactical flexibility. This is where foraging on the enemy becomes a necessity, not just an opportunity.
The logistical superiority gained by foraging is huge, and again, he quantifies it. 1 cartload of the enemy's provisions, due to the difficulty of transportation and loss, is equivalent to 20 of our own.
20 to 1.
20 to 1. This extreme efficiency is critical for maintaining rapid advance and avoiding exhausting state resources. Speed saves money and morale.
Speed and logistics enable flexible deployment, which brings us to Chapter 5, Energy and the relationship between the direct and the indirect, or Cheng and Cheng. This is arguably the most important operational concept. What's the fundamental difference between these two forces?
The direct, or Cheng, is the expected maneuver. It's what sets the stage and confirms the enemy's assumptions. It's the standard deployment, the known threat.
And the indirect?
The indirect, or Cheng, is the surprising, unorthodox maneuver needed to secure victory. It is the unexpected pivot.
So, Cheng fixes the enemy's attention, and Cheng executes the strike. They're supposed to be mutually interchangeable and lead onto each other, yielding infinite possibilities.
That's the key synthesis. They must be used together, like the flow of a river or the combination of the 5 musical notes. You can't win merely with the direct because the enemy anticipates it. You must use the direct force to create the conditions for the indirect force to succeed.
Which allows for the successful execution of simulated appearances, which is the essence of tactical mastery. You had to be the opposite of what you pretend to be.
Right. Simulated disorder demands perfect discipline. Simulated fear demands great courage, and simulated weakness demands actual overwhelming strength.
The Sun Pin anecdote illustrates this perfectly.
It does. He used the expected movement into Wei territory and then the Che, which was the indirect deception of reducing his campfires.
By reducing his campfires from 100,000 down to 20,000 over 3 days, Sun Pin used logistics to project overwhelming weakness and cowardice. He convinced his rival Ping Chuan that the Che army was just collapsing.
And Ping Chuan, arrogant and confident that he was merely chasing stragglers, he pursued them hotly, only to fall right into Sun Pin's ambush and be defeated. It was a victory won entirely through psychological preparation and strategic misdirection, a perfect example of Qi being used to crush a self-satisfied enemy.
Moving on to Chapter 6, Weak Points in Strong, the concept of tactical fluidity is emphasized, famously likened to water.
Yes. Water, in its natural course, it avoids high places and seeks the path of least resistance. Similarly, in war, the commander must avoid what is strong and strike at what is weak, adapting strategies precisely to the opponent and the terrain.
Water retains no constant shape, and neither should your military position.
If you retain a constant shape, the enemy will know exactly how to counter you. And this fluidity is the secret to what's called the unseen victory. The clever fighter excels in winning with ease.
How does he do that?
He wins by making no mistakes, by controlling the circumstances and positioning himself perfectly before the battle is ever joined. His victories, they bring him neither reputation for wisdom nor credit for courage.
Why not?
Because he triumphs over circumstances that have not yet come to light. He is conquering an enemy that, due to his positioning, is already defeated.
This concept of proactive positioning is tied directly to the ground itself. The entire spectrum of strategic terrain, defined in Chapter 11 as the 9 situations, is a core tactical lesson that must be mastered.
Indeed. Sun Tzu categorizes the ground not just by geography, but by its psychological and logistical impact on the troops. And understanding these is vital because they determine the operational rules.
Okay, let's look at a few examples beyond the famous desperate ground, just to show the comprehensive nature of this framework. Start with dispersive ground.
So dispersive ground is near home. When soldiers are fighting in their own country, they may scatter easily because they're close to family and familiar comforts. The general's rule here is to inspire unity. Keep the forces interconnected, focusing on cohesion before any major engagement. You have to fight the psychological pull of home.
Makes sense. Then you have contending ground.
This is ground whose possession offers an advantage to both sides. If the enemy occupies it, the general must avoid attacking it immediately. Instead, he has to lure the enemy away from it using deception. If he occupies it first, he must ensure his defense is overwhelming.
You can't fight over contending ground with mere bravado. You have to use artifice to acquire or retain it cheaply.
Exactly. And finally, the most extreme, desperate ground.
This is ground on which survival is only possible by fighting without delay, where there is literally no place of refuge.
And Sun Tzu's famous harsh tactic here is essential. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape. You force them into deadly peril.
This is the ultimate application of morale: burning your boats, breaking your cooking pots, forcing a desperate, immediate engagement to secure survival. Men, seeing death as the only alternative to victory, will prefer death to flight.
It's strategy operating at the highest psychological pressure point. The depth of penetration determines cohesion. Penetrating but a short way means dispersion. Penetrating deeply brings cohesion because the troops realize their only way out is forward, together.
Moving into operational management, Sun Tzu turns his attention to the general's accountability. He outlines the ways a leader can fail his army. Chapter X, Terrain, identifies 6 calamities that arise not from natural causes, but entirely from the general's own fault.
These are the 6 ways of courting defeat, and they are failures of judgment or discipline. For example, flight occurs when a numerically inferior force is hurled foolishly against another 10 times its size, the general's fault being not calculating the enemy's strength beforehand.
Another key failure is insubordination. When the common soldiers are too strong and their officers too weak, what causes that kind of imbalance?
It's a failure of the commander to establish clear authority and discipline from the start. We see this in the historical anecdote of Tian Pu. His soldiers openly flouted his authority, treating the campaign like a disorganized, outing thousands riding about the camp on donkeys.
And when he finally tried to engage the enemy,
They just dispersed, leaving him to commit suicide. It shows that structure matters as much as courage. The opposite problem, ruin, occurs when high officers are angry and insubordinate, giving battle prematurely on their own account because they resent the commander-in-chief's authority.
so the general has to manage the resentments and ambitions of his own subordinates?
Yes, the general's personal psychology is, therefore, as crucial as his military strategy. Beyond these structural failures, Sun Tzu identifies 5 psychological weaknesses that are ruinous to the conduct of war. These are the 5 dangerous faults.
And these reveal the critical internal threats to leadership, often rooted in personal character. The faults include recklessness, cowardice, a hasty temper, and a delicacy of honor.
Right, the first 4 are relatively easy to understand. Recklessness leads to destruction. Cowardice leads to capture. A hasty temper leads to distraction when provoked by insults. Delicacy of honor leads to fighting rashly just to save face.
But the 5th fault is the one that really jars modern sensibilities. Over-solicitude for his men, excessive worry for his men, which Sun Tzu warns, exposes him to worry and trouble, compromising his judgment. It just seems cruel to call compassion a fault.
It's not a call for cruelty, but for necessary ruthlessness guided by strategic reality. Sun Tzu is saying that if a general is so focused on protecting every single life, he becomes incapable of making the difficult choice, like throwing his men onto desperate ground, which is sometimes the only path to collective survival.
The commander has to treat his men as resources, capable of sacrifice for the ultimate goal.
Yes. If sentiment clouds judgment, the entire army and the state will fail. It's a purely utilitarian, pragmatic view of leadership.
The message is clear. Personal sentiment cannot interfere with operational necessity. Beyond psychological control, Sun Tzu insists on controlling the elements themselves. Let's look at his almost scientific approach to elemental warfare in Chapter 12, The Attack by Fire.
This section is intensely granular. It shows the commander must integrate military plans with astrological and meteorological data. A fire attack has to be planned using the proper season dry weather, and the special days are determined by the position of the moon in specific constellations: the sieve, the wall, the wing, or the crossbar.
Why those constellations?
Because those 4 mark the predictable days of rising wind.
So the commander has to be an astronomer and a meteorologist. It really emphasizes that a commander must rely on a level of preparedness that integrates military plans with a total preparedness for the natural world.
And he must anticipate 5 possible developments once fire is started, like knowing whether to attack immediately when fire breaks out inside the enemy's camp or whether to hold back if the enemy remains quiet. And the crucial warning, do not attack from the leeward because a wind that rises in the daytime lasts long, but a night breeze soon falls. He's providing battlefield meteorology.
This brings us to the ultimate strategic tool, the subject of Chapter 13, Intelligence Dominance, or the use of spies. What is the foundation that enables the wise general to achieve things beyond the reach of ordinary men?
Foreknowledge. The entire strategic system rests on getting accurate, predictive information. And Sun Tzu's name is insistent that this crucial foreknowledge cannot be elicited from spirits, nor obtained inductively from experience, nor by deduction or calculation.
It can only be obtained from men. Human intelligence is the absolute irreplaceable foundation of wise command.
Yes. The general must devote significant resources to intelligence because war is expensive, but neglecting intelligence is even more ruinous. He has to know and manage the 5 classes of spies.
Okay, let's run through them.
First, local spies. Inhabitants of the enemy's country. Second, inward spies. Enemy officials who have been corrupted. Third, converted spies, or fanjian. Enemy spies who have been successfully turned to our side. Fourth, doomed spies, or sijan. These are used to carry false information to the enemy and are expected to be caught and eliminated. And fifth, surviving spies, those who successfully return with news.
The converted spy is the linchpin of the entire system. Why is he considered the most critical asset?
The converted spy is explicitly stated to be the source of all other information. He's the one who possesses the foreknowledge necessary to exploit the other classes. He knows which local inhabitants are greedy and which officials are open to corruption, making bribery possible. Therefore, Sun Tzu Mendes, he must be treated with the utmost liberality and care.
The depth of intelligence required is incredible. It's not enough just to know the enemy's deployment or logistics. Even for an assassination or a critical bribe, the general must know the names of the enemy's attendants, aides-de-camp, gatekeepers, and generals in charge.
It's total information superiority. The intelligence operation must be total, penetrating even the most intimate levels of the enemy command structure. The final rule of maneuver sums up the doctrine of patience and decisive action derived from this perfect foreknowledge.
What's the rule?
At first, then, exhibit the coyness of a maiden until the enemy gives you an opening. Afterwards, emulate the rapidity of a running hare, and it will be too late for the enemy to oppose you.
You wait, using deception, until the intelligence confirms the vulnerability. Then you strike with blinding speed.
That's the whole system in a nutshell.
We've traveled from the historical controversy of Sun Tzu's existence, surviving the skepticism to place the work firmly in the 5th century BC. We've dissected the strategic emphasis on speed, the profound avoidance of costly sieges, the precise calculus of war costs, and acknowledged that the entire system relies on strategic deception and ultimately absolute human intelligence dominance.
The 13 chapters reveal themselves not as a collection of truisms, but as a deeply sophisticated, almost scientific manual for the commander, detailing everything from atmospheric timing to political loyalty, all synthesized by centuries of commentary.
And here's the final implication, something for you to reflect on. Sun Tzu insists that the general is the arbiter of the people's fate, granted the immense moral and strategic authority to disobey the sovereign if fighting leads to defeat. He must be perfect free of the 5 dangerous faults, master of every tactical variation, and capable of generating unseen victories.
Given that this ideal general is constantly battling the financial strain of the state, relying on fallible human spies for his essential foreknowledge, and must overcome profound psychological weaknesses like recklessness or excessive compassion, you have to constantly ask, is the ideal Sun Tzu commander an unreachable standard of total strategic and psychological control, regardless of his mastery of the 13 chapters?
Or is the value of the text simply in eliminating the gap between the ideal and the achievable, forcing the commander to recognize his own fallibility? It's a challenge to strive for the impossible standard while acknowledging its human cost. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the history, heresy, and hidden strategy of the art of war.